Brise de Mer felt untouchable. But one unexpected enemy proved more deadly than any other. An enemy from within. Yet, in the 90s, the future looked so bright. Business for Brise had never been so good.
All the money had been reinvested in highly profitable businesses. This meant increased financial strength for Brise.
Brise was sitting on untold wealth. The Mafia group was said to own more than 50 front companies and nearly 300 bank accounts in Switzerland and Asia.
Back then, money was pouring in. The huge empire they'd created meant we could rest easy for many years to come.
Not to mention the heist of the century, courtesy of Franck Casanova. A bonanza for all the bosses of Brise, who shared the tens of millions, hoping to be able to take a step back and finally live a little. Just because you've become a thug doesn't mean you've forgotten your childhood dreams. Here, in jail, Francis Mariani had all the time in the world to think about his. He spent 5 years here after an armed robbery in Marseille. Now, with the end in sight, he made himself a promise. He would, at long last, be living the dream. Do something he's wanted to do ever since he was a child. Become a rally driver and race on the legendary roads of Corsica.
Motorsport's a part of Corsican culture. The tour of Corsica is in our genes. In every family, there's someone who was in the race. Everyone talks about it.
At the time, the Tour of Corsica was the pinnacle of motorsports. To be on the starting line was a dream come true.
Barely a foot out of the door, the boss of Brise donned his new outfit. At 43, he was not exactly in his prime to be a race driver, but that didn't stop him from putting his money where his mouth was.
Racing costs a fortune. But for Francis Mariani, this was the ultimate joy. So clearly, he pulled all the stops to be able to compete.
Money was no object. He could count on his share of the UBS heist. With the honeypot secure, his sweet dreams were finally within reach. For his first rallies, Francis Mariani enlisted another familiar face of Brise de Mer, Paul-Louis Guazelli, as his co-driver. But the first year was marred by a series of mechanical failures.
At first, he really seemed out of his depth. On his first lap, he went off the road after 200 meters, but quickly improved.
But for Mariani, racing was not enough. He wanted to win, so he called upon a more savvy co-pilot.
I was a rally co-pilot. That was my day job. He said to me one day, "Let's race together." And I said, "Okay." We were very good friends because we came from different backgrounds and the alchemy was right. We just clicked.
Pas d'état d'âme pour Francis Mariani. Il prend tout de suite le commandement de la course. À la mi-journée, son avance est déjà de 26 secondes sur Loubet.
J'ai attaqué selon mes moyens, puis avec j'ai un bon coéquipier qui m'aide beaucoup, hein, parce que c'est pas, faut s'en occuper de la voiture, hein.
I think he had limitless cash. It was impressive.
His Subaru was the best Subaru on the market. We're talking 300 or 400,000 euros.
The Baron of Brise spent lavishly and stopped at nothing to ensure victory.
He had the means to do all kinds of things. I remember one race, changing tires between stages takes time, but if you do it, you drive faster. So what did he do? He hired a helicopter, and in between stages, the helicopter stopped mid-air and dropped new tires, so he could change his tires.
Race after race, Francis Mariani forged himself a reputation as a serious contender. Among his unwavering fans were, of course, members of Brise de Mer, including Richard Casanova, who never missed a race to support his old pal.
Back then, they were still very close. They stayed at each other's place with their families, their kids and everything. They were very tight.
In the early 90s, Richard Casanova was still officially on the run and under the threat of an arrest warrant issued after the UBS heist. However, his connections allowed him to come and go as he pleased.
He vanished. But for a man like Richard Casanova, vanishing doesn't mean going into hiding under a false identity. Casanova has many friends everywhere.
Many friends, and many ventures too, one of which was a long-time pet project. Casanova was a soccer fan at heart, and he wouldn't mind a little sway on and off the pitch, an ambition shared with another member of La Brise, Dominique Rutily. Together in Marseille, the two men had done it all, even before joining La Brise de Mer.
Rutily and Casanova were a pair. Back then, one was never seen without the other. They were inseparable.
Dominique Rutily had recently become president of a small-town football club in Calvi, in the north of Corsica. But together with his friend Casanova, they had set their sights higher and wanted to play in the big league. Their dream would come true with a little help from one of the major players in the world of business and French politics. Bernard Tapie. At the time, he was the president of the Olympique de Marseille Football Club.
I have heard first-hand testimonies from Richard Casanova and Dominique Rutily about their involvement with OM. Richard told me how they acted as problem fixers for Bernard Tapie, particularly with the supporters union and with players, among other things.
The relationship with Tapie isn't really a mob story. It's based on a true friendship. Rutily and Casanova were good friends with Pascal Olmeta, the Matra Football Club's goalkeeper. And at that time, Bernard Tapie wanted to sign him for OM.
Pascal Olmeta, a Bastia native, was playing for Matra Racing, a Parisian club. Before his transfer to OM, the goalkeeper asked the best negotiator in his entourage to broker the deal, Richard Casanova.
Richard went to Tapie and asked 4 times the original fee. And Tapie accepted it all. He accepted it all. At that point, Casanova and Rutily became very good friends with Tapie. Rutily couldn't have been happier because football was his passion.
I was curious as to what kind of interactions Tapie could have had with a character like Richard Casanova. One day, I met Tapie for an article in the newspaper Le Monde. I asked him questions about that, and he confirmed it all, except he called them kids, because Richard and Dominique were still young at the time. He said, sure, they did me some favors. They've been helping out.
The inseparable duo of Casanova and Rutily were doing Tapie some favors. But what kind of favors? Maybe it was their vigorous takeover of some of the most influential Marseille supporters clubs, which had become a bit too unruly for Tapie's blood? Or maybe the pair provided logistical support for Tapie's election campaign in the Bouches-du-Rhône. In any case, Casanova and Rutily firmly established themselves in the world of football. And they were on the verge of buying out another major club in the south of France, OGC Nice, and they were keen on turning it into a new flagship of French football. Adrenaline-hungry Francis Mariani was pushing his limits on the tracks. Rally had become much more than a hobby as he competed in nearly 10 races a year and gradually worked his way up to the top.
He kept getting better every year. It became harder and harder to beat him.
Victory was ingrained in him. He had to win. Victory was paramount. Losing didn't agree with him at all.
Through sheer determination, the godfather of Le Brise won his first victories. Francis Mariani made headlines again, this time in the sports section. His name was respected as much as it was feared.
He could be scary, too, of course. That's what made him such a character.
A character whose nickname seemed at odds with his career as a godfather of organized crime. Zorro.
One day, someone asked him a question about his Subaru. How well do you know your car? Francis replied, well, my car is like Zorro. One minute you know it, the next you don't. And I thought he was actually talking about himself. Francis was like Zorro. One minute we knew him, the next we didn't.
With Mariani, it was easy to forget the other side of the coin. Behind the mask of a respected driver, revered by his peers, lied a thug, very much active and violent.
Francis wasn't much of an investor. Others invested left and right in different ventures, but not him. He was a big spender, and regularly he found himself without a penny because the tour of Corsica and the cars cost him a fortune. So what does he do? He says, I know a couple of punks who make money in Marseille. We're going to take care of them. So he takes 2 or 3 young guys with him, quietly goes to Marseille, and then pop, 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 job's done. He kills the guy, robs him, goes to his associates and says, your boss is dead. I killed him. I'm your boss now. He goes back to Corsica, and the cash just flows in without him having to do any work. That's his mark. His staple is murder.
Meanwhile, Richard Casanova and Dominique Rutily's dream was about to become a reality. The OGC Nice takeover would soon be finalized. At last, they would have their own team in the top league. The 2 bosses of Le Brise had drafted one of the game's most respected figures. Roland Courbis had been head coach with some of France's top clubs and was known for his sometimes unsavory connections.
We knew Roland Courbis from his time as Toulon's manager. He then went on to coach Marseille. He was a great guy, former player, and he was good friends with Dominique Rutily. These links between football and crime are hardly surprising. That's the way it was back then, and perhaps the way it still is in the south of France.
Roland Courbis's reach was long. His presence would give credibility to the OGC Nice takeover. But Dominique Rutily's past was about to catch up with him. On March 30th, 1996, he went on a trip with his friend Roland Courbis to spend a few days with him.
During that trip, they were supposed to try and finalize the OGC Nice deal.
But first, the 2 friends made a stop in Guérin in the Var region for a football game. The local team was hosting Calvi. As soon as the game was over, they headed for the car park.
Rutily is making a call on his mobile phone, a few steps away from Courbis, who's by the car. And just then, they're startled by gunshots.
De toute évidence, les 2 hommes sont tombés dans un guet-apens soigneusement préparé et c'est Dominique Rutily qui était la cible des tueurs. Il est mort sur le coup. Le président du club de Calvi a été abattu de plusieurs balles dans la tête. Il s'agit donc d'une exécution en règle à laquelle Dominique Rutily ne devait pas échapper.
This was brutal. Rutily received 4 11-43 bullets in the back when he was facing away from the killers, and 2 9mm in the head to finish him off at close range. The bullets were recovered at the scene.
Roland Courbis est grièvement blessé de 2 balles dans l'abdomen. Il est aussitôt transporté à l'hôpital d'hier. Ce soir, son état n'inspire plus d'inquiétude.
The death of Dominique Rutily shook la Brise de Mer to its core. It was the first time a key member was murdered, an ominous first. For Richard Casanova, the death of his alter ego spelled the end of his football fad. He now had his mind elsewhere.
It was a major blow for Richard. We'd never seen him like this before. Dominique was like a brother to him. So he only had one thing on his mind, revenge. Who did this?
One of the founding principles of La Brise is, if you hurt one of us, we will exact vengeance together.
The police investigation into Rutily's murder stalled, from dead ends to countless assumptions. But La Brise was also on the case.
Truth be told, La Brise was in a better place than we were to identify the perps, or at least the backer or the group responsible.
La Brise unleashed its vast network of assets to track down those who dared attacking one of its own. Years after the death of Rutily, members of the Bastia clan did not relent from their quest to punish the killers. At the turn of the millennium, Richard Casanova had become a full-fledged businessman, conducting his business all over the world. In Africa, of course, but also in South America, where he invested in casinos and silver mines. Francis Mariani had just claimed victory in a legendary race in Corsica, La Ronde de Giraglia. He was basking in glory. He didn't know this race would be his last. The age of peace and quiet was over. Together with Casanova, the 2 bosses of La Brise had to take up arms again. After 4 years of searching, La Brise had identified the man responsible for Dominique Rutily's execution. He had just been spotted in Sartène in southern Corsica.
It took them a while to find out who'd done it. But as they say, revenge is a dish best served cold, especially in Corsica.
Almost all La Brise core members had made the trip. Their goal was to kidnap the man responsible for Rutily's death. They wanted to make him talk and rat out on his accomplices.
It's an actual commando operation led by founding members of the clan. They're here to get justice.
Among the dozen men present were Richard Casanova and Francis Mariani, as well as Pierre-Marie Santucci, Maurice Costa, and Alexandre Chevrière. The group was soon informed that the man they're looking for had just left Sartène. Revenge would have to wait. But after this setback, the trip took a sudden and unexpected turn. A restaurant owner in the town had recognized some of the members of La Brise. Fearing for the life of his son, who was in conflict with the Bastia clan, he called the gendarmerie and claimed to be the victim of an extortion attempt.
The gendarmes acted very quickly without really knowing what was going on. They saw 5 people sitting on a wall. These people were some of the bosses of La Brise de Mer and 2 accomplices from Marseille.
The gendarmes started their questioning without knowing they were talking to members of La Brise. But one of them, Richard Casanova, was a fugitive.
So Richard was with the group, and as soon as he spotted the cops, he was out of there. He jumped over the wall and got away. But the others were like, this is just the local police, big deal.
Even though the restaurant owner eventually withdrew his complaint, they were in custody. And that's what mattered. That's what led to their arrest, especially since gendarmes had just found a bag in the car of the gang. Inside was an automatic weapon, knives, and more chilling, a butcher's hook. That was more than enough to put them all in jail.
Apparently, Mariani was livid. He reckoned that once again Casanova had managed to get away with it, while he himself had to rot in prison.
At the Borgo prison near Bastia, the bosses were at home. They knew the charges against them wouldn't hold for long. They just had to be patient. Francis Mariani was biding his time. Now that he couldn't drive his fast cars anymore, he found solace by playing rally video games on his PlayStation. Out in the real world, however, something disrupted Mariani's peace and quiet. His eldest son, Jacques, had just been the victim of an assassination attempt. Jacques Mariani was gravitating in Brise galaxy. Maintaining some independence when it came to business, he was never far away because of his family ties. In the criminal world, he was known as Le Mat, after the Fool card in the Marseille tarot deck. From an early age, the eldest of the Mariani family followed in his father's footsteps in the underworld. Armed robbery, racketeering, corruption. Jacques had spent his life in and out of prison and rarely enjoyed bouts of freedom.
Francis was having fits of rage about Jacques. Since he was 16, Jacques was at war. He was always fighting someone, and then someone else. Instead of placing his pawns like a savvy chess player, he would knock over the table.
And this time, Francis Mariani had a lot to worry about. Apparently, the assassination attempt was the work of an underground Corsican nationalist group, which also happened to be threatening the interest of Brise. From then on, the Godfather had only one thing on his mind: a prison break.
There are several ways to escape. You can break the walls, smash the door, kill a guard, take someone hostage, escape by helicopter. These are all pretty violent methods, but the three bosses of Brise come up with the gentlest mode of escape ever.
They have this outlandish idea of having a judge in Ajaccio send a fax to the prison demanding their immediate release.
At 5:04 p.m. on the 31st of May 2001, a fax arrived at the Borgo Prison Administration's office, sent by the judge investigating the Sartène case. The demand was simple. The three defendants, Maurice Costa, Pierre-Marie Santucci, and Francis Mariani, were to be released immediately. Of course, it was a fake, but a very convincing one, and their accomplices had a foolproof plan.
The fax originated from a hotel in Aix-en-Provence. It takes a skilled technician to make sure that the number of the Ajaccio court appears on the fax instead of the hotel's number.
The only concern was with the guards. What if they called the court and asked for confirmation? But Brise had this covered too.
It's late, and there's no one left at Ajaccio's court, and there's no way to confirm anything. So the prison's administration decides to follow the fake order given by the court to the letter. Here we have three stalwarts of Brise who have the incredible good fortune of being able to freely exit Borgo prison without breaking out.
They go through the prison gates, exchange goodbyes with the prison officers, saying, "See you next time."
The French courts had been ridiculed. To make matters worse, their escape was not an actual breakout. No extra charges could be brought against the defendants on this matter.
People started sneering. No one can stop Brise. They're the best.
We were gobsmacked. How could they do it? That's unheard of, but it was true. This was an amazing escape, and a legal one at that.
Free at last, Francis Mariani could put his son's affairs in order, as well as those of Brise. A new clandestine nationalist group, Armata Corsa, posed a new threat. Its seminal moment was the murder of someone close to Brise.
Le 21 juillet dernier, Dominique Savelli, 29 ans, était assassiné en plein centre de Belgodère. Hier, le dossier a connu un rebondissement spectaculaire après un texte signé Armata Corsa revendiquant et justifiant l'exécution de Dominique Savelli.
This execution rang like a declaration of war, especially since the criminal group was quick to position itself as a competitor in the fields of restaurant racketeering and slot machines on the Brise territories.
That's what started the fire. You're after my turf? If so, we'll have to fight over the same cake. This led to frictions and eventually dead bodies.
On the one hand, the Brise de Mer gang with all its might, and on the other, Corsican nationalism at its rawest. The recipe for disaster and death.
Derrière cette BMW au pare-brise criblé d'impacts de balles, le corps sans vie de François Santoni, l'une des figures du nationalisme corse. Selon les premiers éléments de l'enquête, le ou les tueurs ont tiré en rafale sur Santoni. Une quarantaine de douilles ont été retrouvées sur place.
On the 17th of August 2001, François Santoni, the presumed leader of Armata Corsa, was murdered after attending a wedding. To complicate matters further, Armata Corsa had also made enemies in the Nationalist camp. Investigators were baffled as to where the bullets came from.
We didn't know. Could have been nationalists, could have been Labrise, or maybe an alliance of convenience.
It was never a good idea to get in the way of Labrise and its allies. Over the next 6 months, Armata Corsa was decimated.
Assisterait-on à une élimination programmée d'Armata Corsa? Depuis le 17 août dernier, date de l'assassinat de François Santoni, 7 de ses membres présumés ayant eu un lien avec le petit ou le grand banditisme sont tombés sous les balles des tueurs.
All I can say is that the whole gang of Labrise was pulled into this war. And I mean all of them, because they were all involved. They did some very horrible things. They tortured people, stuff that makes horror films seem nice.
There was the story of a young Armata Corsa member who was abducted from his parents' home by fake police officers. The gang took him deep into the forest, where they tied his arms and legs with ropes and quartered him.
L'hécatombe de l'automne n'est pas terminée. Nicolas Gros, Fernand Bertini, Pascal Rogliano, Pierre Rocchi.
One sleazy murder after another, this wave of violence rattled the whole of Corsica. 2 25-year-olds were found burnt to a crisp in a car south of Bastia. But this time, the police had a lead, and they were on to the perpetrators of this singularly violent scene.
D'après le scénario reconstitué par les enquêteurs, Jean-Christophe Marcelli aurait dans un premier temps été séquestré par un groupe de truands proches du gang de la Brise de Mer. Parmi eux, Jacques Mariani, le fils de Francis Mariani, l'un des évadés par fax de la prison de Borgo le 31 mai dernier.
Jacques Mariani and an alleged accomplice stood trial in Créteil. All the evidence pointed to them. Text messages exchanged by one of the victims in particular, as he was locked in the boot of the car. However, failings in the police investigation cast doubt among the jurors, who decided on a non-guilty verdict.
In all honesty, Jacques Mariani's acquittal in this case left me wondering. It seemed to me that there was substantial evidence against them, but at the end of the day, it wasn't enough, and they were acquitted.
But Jacques Mariani was not out of the woods yet, and in a new judicial episode of the war between Labrise and Armata Corsa, he found himself in the dock with his father, Francis Mariani. On the 5th of September 2001, 27-year-old Nicolas Montigny, presumed to be a young commander of Armata Corsa, had been murdered in a Bastia cyber cafe. March 2008, the trial for his murder opened in Aix-en-Provence. This time, detectives had a solid piece of evidence. A pair of sunglasses with Jacques Mariani's DNA was found near the crime scene. But the investigation also pointed to his father, Francis Mariani, suspected of having supplied the murder weapon. The godfather of Labrise was a free man when he stood at the trial, but he appeared aged and tired, barely recognizable. He was not sporting his trademark mustache anymore, and now wore reading glasses.
Francis Mariani ne voulait pas rater sa prestation ce matin. Devant la cour, entre ironie et double langage, Francis Mariani va distiller ses accusations. C'est l'armatagorza qui a tué et fait tuer, pas les voyous comme lui.
Francis Mariani is charismatic and straightforward. In other words, he's always the boss, even when he's in court.
The one who sets the tone and directs the trial is Francis Mariani.
Mariani knew he could control almost everything except the verdict, and his acumen told him that things didn't look good.
Le verdict est tombé tard hier soir, mais l'un des principaux accusés n'était plus dans le box pour l'entendre. Francis Mariani, rentré en Corse la veille, aurait raté l'avion du retour. Il n'est pas réapparu depuis. 7 ans de prison par défaut pour Francis Mariani, 15 ans pour son fils Jacques, les deux seuls reconnus coupables de l'assassinat du nationaliste Nicolas Montini.
At 59, no way Francis Mariani was doing any more time. Once again, he fled for one last and deadly run. For some time now, Francis Mariani had been wary of his old friend Richard Casanova. Casanova being at large for so long didn't help. The two friends saw little of each other, except at meetings of Labrise, which were few and far between. Over time, being separated, resentment piled up.
This allowed room for distrust. They started suspecting each other. You have greed, you have betrayal, and you have someone who wants revenge on a treacherous brother. This is a kind of Greek tragedy.
Mariani took a dim view of some of Casanova's investments, especially his dealings with African business, and the fact that he apparently didn't share any of the profits.
Richard Casanova had more economic power and influence than Francis Mariani. That can lead to personal jealousies and ego clashes, something these two men were very prone to.
For now, Mariani silently brooded over his acrimony, but a string of events was about to change everything. He'd been 16 years on the run, but justice had finally ruled on Richard Casanova in the UBS case. He'd been sentenced in absentia to 12 years in prison. This sentence put him back at the top of the wanted list.
This arrest created an immediate problem. How do you stop Casanova with a photograph from 1980?
We were wondering whether he still had the same face. There were rumors suggesting that he'd had plastic surgery. Was it true or was it not? We started looking for a recent photo of Richard Casanova.
The Office for Wanted Persons carried out a search at his wife's home to obtain a more recent photo.
The operation proved a success. The office managed to find a photo of Casanova on a beach in southern Corsica. He was somewhat older and clearly hadn't had any plastic surgery at all.
The police eventually found not one, but 2 photos. The wanted poster was put up on the walls of every police station and gendarmerie in France. 3 months later, out of sheer luck, Casanova was spotted by the police.
In March 2006, I set up surveillance in a completely different, unrelated case. And at one point, on the radio, one of my guys says to me, "Hey, I've just recognized Casanova. He's in a parked vehicle outside a school." I actually didn't advise anyone and made the arrest. He was stopped in the most conventional way. No fuss and no violence whatsoever.
The surprisingly smooth arrest put an end to a 16-year run, a record in Corsica. As Richard Casanova headed back to prison, 25 years after his first incarceration, organized crime in Corsica was on the verge of a major upheaval. Since the early 80s, the map of organized crime in Corsica had followed the administrative division of the island. While the north was the territory of Brise de Mer, the south was controlled by another clan and its undisputed boss, Jean Colonna, a former member of the French Connection. He was a charismatic figure, vastly respected and feared, including by members of Brise de Mer.
For a long time, Jean Colonna capitalized on a myth. It's true that as long as he was alive, La Brise confined itself to North Corsica and never ventured into South Corsica. A pax mafiosa of sorts was in place until 2006. There was no declared war until, that is, the accidental death of Jean Colonna.
The death made headlines in Corsica. At the age of 67, the godfather of South Corsica had just perished in a car crash. After hitting a bridge, the car ended up at the bottom of a ravine.
At that point, the one person who maintained a state of relative order in Corsica is gone.
Jean Colonna's heirs did not command the same authority as their late leader. But now, South Corsica was wide open.
Organized crime in Corsica is in constant eruption. The passing of the man who was considered the godfather of South Corsica simply made everyone hungry, and everyone wanted his share of the cake.
Indeed, players revealed their sharp appetites and ambitions. 3 weeks after the death of the godfather of South Corsica, Richard Casanova was released on bail for 150,000 euros. It's just as well, since he had already started to invest in the south of the island.
At the time, he had invested in many real estate and land projects. This expansion was bound to fuel rivalries. Mariani believed Casanova had betrayed La Brise de Mer and suspected him of profiting from things behind his back.
Mariani had no intention of letting Casanova take over South Corsica on his own. But there was a problem. No other members of La Brise wanted to get near a new turf war.
Other barons of La Brise have clearly settled down in a cozier way of life. Casanova and Mariani are still in action, and their buoyancy is not shared with the other founding members.
In a bid to counter Casanova, Mariani approached Jean Colonna's former lieutenants, the new lords of South Corsica, and offered an alliance.
Francis Mariani knows better. He can't do it alone. That's why he goes to Colonna's lieutenants.
Time is of the essence. Mariani now suspected Casanova of setting up a rival team with his brother-in-law, Jean-Luc Germani, a rising figure in Corsica's organized crime.
Jean-Luc Germani has built a solid reputation for his professional qualities, in the criminal sense, that is. He's making his own way, independently of Richard.
For Mariani, the alliance between Casanova and Germani had a bitter ring to it and felt like a foretold betrayal. Around 7:30 p.m. on the 22nd of November 2007, Francis Mariani was heading home in his Porsche. All of a sudden, snipers hidden around a bend opened fire on the vehicle. Mariani was hit in the forearm. He ducked and stepped on the gas. He drove into the night. It was a miracle he was still alive. Mariani had made a long list of enemies during his criminal career. However, there was no doubt in his mind. Casanova and his new ally Germani were responsible for this. It hardly mattered that he did not have a shred of evidence. Casanova, Germani, the pair had become his morbid obsession.
Mariani seems to be rushing headlong into this quest with a little solitude and a lot of paranoia.
This guy could be obsessed. If he had an enemy in his cross eye, he had to kill him. He had to off him somehow, no matter what the consequences were. And so he went too far.
Crazy with revenge, Francis Mariani had hired a small-time crook he met in prison as his driver and henchman. The hunt was on.
Francis was adamant Richard had tried to kill him, so he went looking for him and his brother-in-law everywhere. He crisscrossed the whole of Corsica to find him for weeks. Personally, I'm convinced that Richard had nothing to do with it. Because if you kill Mariani, it means La Brise is no longer untouchable. And you kind of shoot yourself in the foot. Richard would never have been foolish enough to do that.
Puzza o sangue. It smells like blood. That's what Francis Mariani kept telling his driver, frothing with rage.
Mariani is fueled by his need for revenge and violence.
In the boot of the car, there was an automatic rifle at the ready. It was mounted with a silencer and already loaded.
« 11h20 ce matin, Richard Casanova sort d'une concession automobile à Porto Vecchio et s'apprête à rejoindre sa camionnette lorsqu'un projectile de gros calibre l'atteint sur le flanc. Richard Casanova décédera quelques minutes après l'arrivée des secours. Au moins un tireur embusqué à quelques mètres de la concession attendait la victime. Le guet-apens ne fait quasiment aucun doute.
Richard Casanova died at the age of 48. His funeral in the cathedral of Bastia's Old Port was attended by friends and family as well as all of his associates from Brise de Mer. All except Francis Mariani, but he had an excuse. He was on the run. The religious ceremony was conducted by a deacon close to Casanova and all the bosses of Brise, Father Franceschi.
We didn't bury a godfather, but a man. We buried a father, a husband, a son, a brother. In 23 years of ministry, I've had over 100 funerals of people who had been murdered. These funerals are especially difficult. These are excruciating. And that's where our specific culture comes in. We don't just mourn the death of a person. We mourn the way in which the person died.
At the cemetery, Casanova's relatives gazed at the congregation, standing in silence. No one knew who killed the youngest godfather of Brise.
We were standing there, in front of the tomb, staring at each other. We were trying to make sense of this. And to find out who the Judas, the traitor, was.
You might also be overcome by feelings of revenge, some sort of desire to get even with those who have inflicted pain upon you. I'm not saying that this is a rule taught by the Church, but it's human to be overwhelmed by these feelings when you have to live through a moment like that.
Among the funeral's attendees, one man in particular could feel the burden that now squarely rested on his shoulders, Germani. Casanova's brother-in-law.
After Richard's murder, Jean-Luc Germani clearly is the one who has to take responsibility. As the brother of Richard's wife, he has to carry the legacy, and he will take responsibility.
Vendetta. The word was on everyone's lips. And a few days later, some doommongers seemed to know where to point the finger at the Southern clan.
Apparently, Casanova's entourage were told that his assassination was the work of Jean-Jacques Colonna's remaining team.
And who was to blame? The two men to whom Francis Mariani had offered an alliance. The accusation was bogus, but it was too late.
C'est le premier cercle de Jean-Jacques Colonna qui est frappé avec l'assassinat hier d'Ange-Marie Michelotti et celui de Jean-Claude Colonne. L'un était supposé être son lieutenant, le second était un proche parent. Les deux hommes ont été tués à 3 semaines d'intervalle dans des circonstances similaires.
The Southern clan had been beheaded. Its two main heirs were presumed collateral victims of the vendetta of Casanova's relatives.
They died in vain, that's for sure. At first, everyone actually thought it was Jean-Jacques' men, the Southern clan, who did it. But in fact, it wasn't them. We quickly realized it was Francis Mariani. And we thought, how could Francis do that? He was his friend.
Richard Casanova's friends and family were in for surprise. They learned that at least 2 other members of Brise had been informed of Francis Mariani's grim plans and had not stopped him.
Francis Gozelli seems to be the only one who actually scolded Francis Mariani after the murder, as he is still full of tension and rage. He said, "You messed up. You could have taken Richard out at any other time. Now we must all go into hiding. Richard's friends, starting with Jean-Luc Germani, are going to be after us."
Brise de Mer was now a shadow of its former self and now lived under impending doom. Ever more isolated, Mariani was jittery, changing hotels, hopping from Corsica to the mainland and back, tracking those who would like to eliminate him. He also put his own house in order, sometimes among those closest to him. Rumor has it that Mariani lured one of his old friends into this clearing in central Corsica and shot him 4 times in the back.
It's sheer violence and authentic mafia slaying.
Eight months had passed since Casanova's murder, and so far, Mariani had been good at cheating death. The godfather of Brise de Mer was hiding in a house on the eastern plain of Corsica with one of his last supporters. Unbeknownst to him, the police were discreetly scrutinizing his comings and goings. An arrest was planned for the next day. But it was the last time they saw him alive.
Le parcours de Francis Mariani s'est terminé ici, dans ce hangar perdu au milieu des vignes. L'explosion et l'incendie qui a suivi ont été d'une grande violence. Un mélange détonnant de fioul et de nitrate. C'est l'ADN qui a permis d'identifier l'un des hommes les plus recherchés de Corse.
The blast was heard several kilometers away and filled the sky with a plume of smoke. Experts spent years trying to confirm the explosion was caused by a remote-controlled bomb. Francis Mariani had apparently bought the explosive device from a former bomb specialist of the FLNC, who had then double-crossed him and used the device against him. What were Mariani's plans with the bomb? No one knows who was his target or who ordered his assassination, even though all fingers point to Richard Casanova's clan. Mariani was buried in his mother's village in southern Corsica. His coffin was carried into the family vault by his staunchest followers of Brise, including Francis Guazelli and Pierre-Marie Santucci. Word was on the street that they did not stop Mariani from exacting revenge on Casanova. Did they know, burying their friend, they had already one foot in the grave?
They will pay for their condoning of Casanova's slaying with their lives. And this is done in a very methodical manner, a proper slaughter.
A month later, Pierre-Marie Santucci received a single bullet through the heart, shot by a sniper 150 meters away. Late 2009, Francis Guazelli was driving in his 4x4 when he was shot dead by two snipers. Another figure of Brise, Maurice Costa, was murdered in 2012, but on this occasion, the vendetta did not come from Casanova's clan.
Those who embrace this way of doing business, shall we say, know the rules. They took a certain path, and they accept the consequences. They knew very well that it could lead them either to a golden life or to the grave.
Brise de Mer had been wiped out. The survivors disappeared into oblivion.
With the fratricidal war between Francis Mariani and Richard Casanova, Brise de Mer imploded. It had lasted for almost 30 years. So its downfall is an upheaval in the history of Corsican organized crime. It's also an earthquake in the history of the criminal world.
What a waste. I think this is a terrible waste. They were so good at what they did that I would never have imagined we'd be where we are right now.
Of course I'm nostalgic. I know some people won't understand why I'd say this, because it's a violent way of life. But if Richard Casanova had not been shot, today, all of us, the whole of Brise, first and second circle, would be billionaires.
But Brise did not vanish without leaving a legacy. First, to its own children, who've taken over the vendetta, the self-perpetuating war. Still, Brise's greatest legacy to the island is a mafia system deeply rooted in Corsica, since the Bastian godfathers met their maker.